Welcome and thank you for joining us today at this online launch event for the book series Contemporary Issues in Science Communication. My name is Clare Wilkinson and I'm the co-director of the Science Communication Unit, which is based at the University of the West of England, or as we're also known, UWE Bristol. And I'm joined here today by two of our wonderful book editors, Dr. Tara Roberson and also Dr. Elizabeth Resekoala. And I'll be introducing Tara and Elizabeth more fully later on. Before I do that, I'm going to mention a few things about today's online event, and then briefly, I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing the book series to you all. So a very practical and slightly dull note to start with. We are recording the session today, and it's going to be available on Bristol University Press, our publisher's website, in due course. If you feel uncomfortable for any reason in terms of participating in that recording, then please feel free to pop out and leave the session, and hopefully you can access that recording at a later date. Our main focus today is going to be on a conversation with our two authors, and I'll be asking a series of questions about their contributions to the series. But there's also going to be an opportunity for you to do so as well at the end of the conversation. So please do have a think and prepare any questions, and you can include those in the Q&A box, as I can see people are already starting to engage with when you're ready. So we'll come to those a little bit later on. And we'd like the conversation today to really echo the spirit of the two books, which both cover sensitive and at times challenging topics. So please consider questions with kindness and care to our speakers and those that are here participating in the event today. At the end of the event, I'll give a few details on how you might become involved with the series if you're interested. And a bit of a spoiler alert, I do have some discount codes available for both books. And I'm going to start now with a bit more information on the series. So Contemporary Issues in Science Communication, what is this particular book series about? Well, it's a book which we hope creates a space to cover a wide range of topics, both in science communication and associated to it in allied disciplines and conversations that might be happening in different sectors. Now, we launched the call for proposals for the book series in September 2020, not an easy time to encourage potential authors to publish a book. So I'm very grateful to Tara, Elizabeth, and their co-contributors for engaging with the series at this point. And our aim was really to create a series which captured a range of topics associated to science communication, creating texts with depth, but also appeal to readers both in and beyond academia. The links on this slide provide more information on the series, and at the end of the event today, I'll provide more information for anyone who's interested in thinking about a proposal to publish with the series. But I don't work alone on this series as series editor. I work alongside some wonderful colleagues at Bristol University Press, and I also work with a fantastic international advisory board to help us understand the topics we should be focusing on, to identify future potential authors, and also in some cases assisting in the review process for both the proposals and the books. So thank you to our international advisory board as well. I think some of them are also here today. So I'm delighted to say that Queering Science Communication, Representations, Theory and Practice, co-edited by Dr. Lindy Orthea and Dr. Tara Roberson, is available now. So you can already access this book if you'd like to. And I know people are, I keep seeing tweets about this book at the moment. Now I'm going to leave Tara to tell us a bit more about the book shortly. And I think Lindy may also be in our audience today. But it's been wonderful to see this book being so warmly received by readers. It's an incredibly important collection, timely and vital, and I, for one, very much enjoyed reading it. Our second book is due for publication at the end of this month on the 31st of July, and this is Race and Sociocultural Inclusion in Science Communication, Innovation, Decolonisation and Transformation, which was edited by Elizabeth. And I'm equally excited about the publication of this book and the very important potential impact it will have on the field of science communication. It raises some incredibly important questions for us to think about as a sector. So today, as I said, I'm joined by two of our authors. Just to mention a little bit more about them, Tara is an experienced science communicator whose work focuses on responsible development of emerging technology. She's passionate about equity and diversity in higher education and STEM, and her contributions in this space have a specific focus on LGBTIQA+ communities. Tara currently works at an Australian research centre where she communicates about the impact of digital technologies on early childhood development. And Elizabeth is president of African Gong, the Pan-African Network for the Popularisation of Science and Technology and Science Communication. With a professional background in chemical engineering, she's researched, presented and written widely on public innovation and transformative development through advancing diversity, sociocultural inclusion and race and gender equality issues in science communication and STEM education for over 25 years. Gosh, quite a lot to get through there, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is also the first African female recipient of an International Science Communication Award, the NAT Award or NAT Award in 2019, conferred by the Natural Science Museum of Barcelona. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and we're going to start with some opening questions for Tara and Elizabeth. So in terms of questions, I think I'm going to come to Tara first, if that's okay. So let me just make sure we've got the focus on you at this point, Tara. And I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the book that you and Lindy have pulled together. So could you talk us through a very short overview of your book?
Of course. Querying Science Communication, and I'm really privileged to be talking for Lindy as well as myself tonight, and she will fact correct me when necessary in the Q&A. So this book is the product of 2+ years work. It feels a little bit longer sometimes, and we have contributions from more than 40 people from across the globe. This book focuses on LGBTIQA+ people, so that's lesbian, gay, bi, trans, non-binary, intersex, agender, asexual, aromantic, and queer people in science communication. So the intention of the book is to make queer topics and people more visible and to encourage work in querying science communication. One thing we did was reflect on how queer people are represented and included in our community and in the artifacts that we produce. And also really thinking about how we can enable, I think, agency and empower LGBTIQA+ communities by challenging cisnormative and heteronormative kind of structures as we find them in the world. So it's the really brief synopsis.
Thanks, Tara. I know there's so much in both of the books. It's very hard to give a really quick summary of them. So if I come to Elizabeth now and ask you, Elizabeth, to tell us a little bit more about the wonderful collection that you've pulled together. Oh, you're muted, Elizabeth, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
Perfect.
Yes. Our book volume, thanks, Claire. Our book volume, Race and Sociocultural Inclusion in Science Communication, Innovation, Decolonization, and Transformation, similarly has taken about 2 years. We have 30 contributing authors, male and female, across the global North and South. It was very important to have a very globally inclusive group of people coming together. And what were we really trying to address here? The first thing was to break through the circular nature of these discourses in science communication around practices, narratives, and representation, and their challenges on delivering on race and sociocultural inclusion paradigms. We keep going around in circles, colleagues, and we're not going anywhere fast. So this book was about saying, let's have a much more straightforward conversation. And secondly, to bring to the fore innovative solutions and good practice exemplars that challenge the contemporary inertia in the science communication field with regard to transformative change on race and sociocultural inclusion issues. Again, to go through this, to break through the inertia of fog of, we're not quite sure what to do. Well, there are people doing it. You may not know about them. So let's bring that to the fore so that you can do it too. So those were really the two premises in terms of the overview of what the book is putting forward and what the contributors had to share.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And yeah, I remember from our very first conversations, this sense of frustration of moving forwards. It felt so incredibly slowly and going around in circles that you've just expressed there. If I stay with you, Elizabeth, for the moment, it would be good to know a little bit more about what inspired you to gather authors to really pull together your edited collection. And I know particularly you work with a lot of authors who perhaps were publishing in this kind of arena for the first time. What were your real motivations and drivers behind creating that space? Hard question.
25 years. I think it's a no-brainer. I think the motivation, drive, and inspiration for bringing together this multidisciplinary group of science communication academics, practitioners, researchers, and social scientists. Let's not forget, that's an important aspect of this book. To produce this book volume was really threefold. The first one was to create a globally inclusive platform where these discourses, knowledge sharing, and paradigm shifting ideas for transformative change on race and sociocultural inclusion in science communication can come together in a cohesive, and that's also been a problem, a cohesive set of narratives and impactful frames. Again, trying to break through this circular scenario. Secondly, to bring to the fore, to the mainstream and from the margins, the voices, lived experiences, and visibility of the many Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been working and advocating for race and sociocultural inclusion in science communication across various regions of the world for many years, many of them unseen, unheard, unknown, and their diverse experiences, so that these can bring a sharper insights into what transformation in diversity, equity, and inclusion should look like from their pivotal perspectives. And thirdly, we wanted to impact on and advance the pace of change in contemporary developments in science communication, whereby race and sociocultural inclusion becomes situated at the core of what excellence, how we define excellence in the field, rather than an optional extra or a nice to have. So when you put all that together, one of the premises for this book was to say that unless we have the people who are themselves most impacted by the marginalization of race and sociocultural exclusion, we are never going to have a real critical and multi-dimensional understanding in science communication of what needs to change. And that's part of how you get the breakthrough. So that's really was the motivation for getting these group together. And I must say that it really was not a struggle to get people to come on board. People were really champing at the bit to have an opportunity to have an enabling environment. And that was another critical thing that I think we need to commend yourself and other colleagues at BUP for. It was part of the game changer, having that enabling environment that your team created, enabled a book such as this to come to the fore. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm really glad that we were able to create that space. I know how much work went into it for you and all of your contributors. Tara, if I come to you now on a similar question, and I guess for your book, it almost feels like it's the very beginning of a conversation in our field, in some senses. So would you like me to repeat the question, or are you happy to carry on from Elizabeth?
No, that's fine. I think there are a lot of common themes in the motivation of how we kind of arrived at this book. Similarly, Claire, you created a really great atmosphere for Lindy and I coming out of the series that you had in the Journal of Science Communication on neglected issues in SciComm. So we wrote a commentary in that space where we were going to talk about LGBTIQA+ matters, because we knew that there wasn't a lot of coverage in our field on those topics. And then in the course of writing that commentary, what we found was that the gap was much wider than we thought. There was this real absence of work by LGBTIQA+ people for queer people, where we saw mentions of queer people in science communication literature. It was either as an object of study or as a kind of category in a research study. So just ticking a box and saying, oh, well, we interviewed a queer person here. So we saw that gap, and then we had this wonderful opportunity to submit the book proposal. And we went out to kind of our wider networks to see what kind of energy there was for contributions in this space, because we knew that we couldn't write it with our own very specific queer experiences alone. We needed to draw on the much more diverse community that we belong to. And we heard from so many people, and this was in like the peak year of COVID, during all of this anxiety and pressure and stress. There was an energy and a real desire to see us represented and having, I guess, the microphone and having agency in starting to shape this area of research. And so that was really what drove it. And it was kind of a challenging couple of years for most of the people that wrote for us. A lot of us changed jobs. We had life flip in very unexpected ways, but they still came through and really produced these just compelling, beautiful stories. And I can't thank them enough, because they've started a really important conversation and I think movement in science communication that I can see continuing. It's exciting. I love talking about that bit.
It does feel very much like the tip of the iceberg, I think, for both books, but in different ways. And both books deal with very timely topics, and also sometimes sensitive and uncomfortable and challenging issues as well. And how would you like to see readers really using these books? And I'm thinking here not only about people who have lived experience of the topics that you're talking about, but also beyond that, how can we be active and insightful allies in science communication and beyond? And perhaps if I stay with Tara for the first response to that question.
Sure. So, I mean, allyship in the space that I'm used to is showing up in the different ways that you can in your different areas of your life. Which is really important and vital for the queer community in this moment, especially for trans and gender diverse folks. Specifically for this book, the three things that I'd really like to see is, I think first, people creating really intentionally welcoming and diverse design in science communication, in our research and in our practice. So some of our contributors reflect on that, particularly around citizen science and spaces like museums and exhibitions. Second, I think it would be wonderful to see more resistance around heteronormative and cisnormative kind of assumptions and default behaviors. And we have people like Sophia, who is in the audience tonight, who talked about that around research on sex, sexuality, and gender. And also we have chapters on health and medical rhetoric. And then third, I think really embracing the unique perspective and capabilities of queer people. So really celebrating some of the strengths that we see. So we had Alison Lee in this book talking about queer storytelling, and also Lindy wrote a wonderful chapter on the capacity of, I guess, this queer psychon mindset for offering a critique of science communication, research and theories. So I think those are 3 points that people can really start from. And we've given them little cheat sheets as well with the teaching notes to try and help start the motion along.
The book's absolutely packed full of stories and case studies and data and all sorts of information, but it's also got some really practical next steps, I think are relevant, for anyone working in science communication, but also if you're in a teaching context, for instance. There's some great ideas shared there. Thank you for that, Tara. Elizabeth, if I come to you then with the same question, I'm just going to make sure you're unmuted, and I'll just do a quick recap. So yeah, I mean, how do you think about the way that readers can use this book and really make sure that they are able to kind of motivate and use the resources in an active and insightful way?
Thanks for that, Claire. One of the criteria, sort of the briefing aspects in the concept brief to the authors, was very much that each chapter had to come up with some very practical suggestions, case studies, exemplars of what practitioners in the field could do. So that was very much a thread that ran through every chapter in the book. And so we think and hope that it would be a lot easier for colleagues to be able to use this book in these 3 ways. The first way we would like to see them use the book is as a resource for multidisciplinary knowledge, insights, and vista-shifting understandings of race and sociocultural inclusion in science communication, because we are aware that the knowledge levels are not where they need to be, certainly in terms of practicalities of what it takes to move from one place to another. And this knowledge will enable them to more effectively transform their practice. So that's the first way we would like them to use the book. Secondly, we would like them to see this book as a place where they come to encounter globally diverse narratives. And that's another missing aspect of our discussions in the field. Globally diverse narratives, which will challenge them. And we all need to be challenged, both in the global north and the global south. And that's the balanced narrative in this book. It's not finger pointing one way. It's saying that in the global north and the global south, we have a problem. The roots of the problem, the manifestations of the problem might be different, but in the contemporary scenario, we're facing the same problem. So this globally diverse narratives, we hope, will challenge them to move from comfort zones, business as usual inertia, and ignorance, excuses, and spur action for change. Thirdly, we would like them to see this book as a repository. We all need a little bit of, I don't know what the word is, encyclopedia or somewhere where you can go and you see good practice exemplars and case studies that you can utilize to undertake your journey of transforming your practices, your institutional frameworks in science communication, and importantly, as a benchmarking tool. Because that's another thing that's missing. How do you benchmark yourself as a science center or museum on race and sociocultural inclusion? Well, in this book, we have very deep, in-depth case studies that will enable you to undertake that benchmarking as you go on that progressive journey in terms of actions to deliver race and sociocultural inclusion. And if I may add, I would also like this book to better inform and impact on the policy making and implementation space for science communication with regards to driving more inclusive and better resourced frameworks for transformative race and sociocultural inclusion in both the global North and South. I know that as practitioners, we don't really talk much or engage much on the policy-making space. But here's the thing, it impacts on everything that we do. It's like the umbrella under which we all shelter. And it's the overarching framework that takes things forward. So I really hope, and I'm pleased that many of the contributors addressed the policy-making space and the links and the gaps of how that affects sociocultural inclusion and other kinds of diversity and equity in the field. So I hope that policymakers will also see this book as giving them guidance on how they can be better allies. We need allies also, colleagues, in the policymaking space, as well as in the academic and the practitioner space. So those would be additional allies that we hope this book will bring to the table. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So comprehensive. And I think that call for sort of structural change is something that's really clear throughout both of your books in different ways. So I've got a couple of additional questions that I'm going to ask in a moment, but just a reminder to those of you that are participating online, if you'd like to ask a question to Tara or Elizabeth, feel free to put those questions into the question and answer box. I understand the chat box I don't think is working, but you can include them in the question and answer box. You can also ask any questions that you have about the series as well. If you'd like the opportunity to ask any questions about books or publishing in the series, feel free to include those, and I'm happy to answer those in a few minutes' time. So Tara and Elizabeth, so many questions that I could ask you, but I'm going to ask you a slightly more specific question now about your two books. And specific question is about a desert island chapter. Now, this is going to be a tough question, I know, to think about a particular question that you might highlight. But is there a chapter in your book that you'd particularly like to tell our participants about today? And if I let Elizabeth have a little break a moment, and I'll come to you, Tara, on that question.
Oh, it's a hard question, Claire. I obviously love every contribution to our book. We received so many different contributions, which was wonderful and difficult at the same time to kind of work together into a cohesive book structure, but everyone was very kind and gracious with us in giving us their time and their contributions. So I think that the chapter that really stands out in my mind is the chapter on coming out and queering science communication in contested spaces, which is specifically located in the Philippines. It's by a wonderful group of authors. It's my favorite because from the moment that I kind of read that first draft to rereading it just this month, it's a really moving piece of work. It's I think, a demonstration of the strength and resilience of queer people. And it talks really strongly and beautifully about the necessity of support from the science communication community. It presents you, I won't give anything away, this is a teaser, but it presents the reader with kind of a series of different stories from the perspective of the different authors of the chapter, and it kind of explores what it means to be part of the LGBTIQA+ community and also exist in the Philippines, work in a STEM culture, and the different influences culturally and socially that kind of brings in for everyone in the chapter. And just as a kind of side note, it also introduces the most beautiful term in, I think, Tagalong for coming out, which equates to unfurling one's cape, which is just a metaphor that has stayed with me since I read the draft. And I just think that that will be with me for the rest of my life. So it's just a beautiful chapter.
I've also read that chapter a couple of times now, Tara, and it is beautifully written. And I think one of the really nice things about both books is that you can certainly read it from cover to cover and have huge impact, but they're also texts that you feel like you're going to go back to and dip into and read particular chapters again in more depth. So thank you. It's very hard to talk about a chapter and not give away all of its secrets. So I appreciate that. Elizabeth, if I come to you now, is there a particular chapter? I know when we were talking about your book and it was progressing, we kept talking about islands in the Caribbean we might like to go to, but was there a particular chapter you'd like to take with you? Oh, you're muted. Sorry, Elizabeth. Could you unmute, Elizabeth? Sorry. Elizabeth. We can't hear you, Elizabeth. Oh, I think your audio.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now. Yeah. So we just had a couple of technical issues.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yes, Dara, a difficult one to answer because all the chapters really resonated and gave this kind of a coherent a set of analysis. But if I can give a cheeky response, I think that there are two chapters in this book that for me, when I read them, having had these two chapters written by two different people, one person in the global north and one person in the global south, I really had goosebumps because these two chapters were the perfect mirror image of this global divide and yet continuum of race and sociocultural inclusion in science communication. Absolutely amazing that two people sitting in two different parts of the world could come up with this perfect mirror image. So we're looking at chapter 5 by Susana Herrera Lima and Sofia Gutierrez Ramirez on the challenges of epistemic justice and diversity in science communication in Mexico. And chapter 10, Falling from Normalcy, Decolonization of Museums, Science Centers, and Science Communication by Mohamed Belhomar. And what was so amazing about those two chapters, if you look at the three parallel themes, so Susanna and Sophia talk about the coloniality of knowledge. The mirror image of that Mohammed puts in the global north is Eurocentric cultural imperialism. Fascinating. Sophia and Alba talk about epistemic injustice. And the mirror image of that in Mohammed's chapter is racial grammar. This wonderful concept brought from Edward Said about how science communication uses this racial grammar that totally erases the contributions of people from other parts of the world, very much along racial lines. And that is what you see in the global north. In the south, it is experienced as epistemic injustice. And in the global south, Susanna and Sophia talk about the traumatic legacy of that colonialism in their institutional frameworks. And Mohammed postulates Gloria Werker's concept of white innocence that creates this normative comfort zone, that creates this massive inertia against change, because nobody sees the reason why things should change, because you have rationalized a whole arsenal of excuses and justifications as to why things are the way they are. And therefore, it's very difficult to change. And then on the other hand, you have the legacy. So for me, those two chapters were absolutely profound. You couldn't have asked for better if you had actually designed it. And I found it really moving. I was very moved to read those two chapters, coming just like that. Every concept, every principle, every challenge, a mirror image of the other, beautifully telling you what that global north-south continuum and divide and connection is. So if you really want to understand where we are in science communication and how we got here in both regions of the world, those two chapters absolutely nailed it, as well as giving practical exemplars as to how we can move forward. So those would go with me to the desert island. Thank you.
I'll definitely let you have two. In fact, I think I'll let you both take the full books. I'm sure that would be fine. I think that point illustrates really nicely, though, the value of these books as edited collections, and we are happy to also publish single and co-authored texts within the series. But on these types of topics, I think the voices that you have coming through, it's really wonderful to have that in an edited collection. So I'm just going to ask one final question, and then we've got a nice amount of time for any additional questions. Thank you. I can see some questions are starting to come through. So we will turn to those next. And my final question is a slightly more practical question. I think hopefully everyone that's here with us today now really wants to read the books. I want to read them again. So I'm going to ask you a very practical question to finish. And that's a question directed more for people here who might be thinking about proposing a book to the series or to other publishers. What would be your one top tip for authors? I've said one, but I can probably be a little bit kinder and let you have more than one if there are many things that you're thinking of. But Tara, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll take two top tips. So I guess the passion around the area that you want to focus on and really spend 2 solid years on, it's important, and it really helps that you have that, as well as really knowing your area and the gap that you really must address in producing this book. And then the second one, on a super pragmatic level, is have a great spreadsheet with a timeline, all of your authors and what you know is coming through from them at different timeframes. Lindy and I still have the most monstrous Google Drive in the entire world, and one day we'll both look at it again. But for now, it's just, a good spreadsheet so you can keep track of it all.
Thanks, Tara. I think you did that amazingly well in terms of when stuff came through to us. So yeah, great work there. And Elizabeth, top tip.
Well, thanks for that, Tara. Passion is all well and good, and it's a useful beginning to have. But I think you have to have what I would call respectful patience, respectful reading, and respectful understanding, especially in an edited collection. It is very easy for you to end up not practicing what you preach. So it's very important that you respect the writing of your contributors, their perspectives, their own situations. But it's also important that you also respect their time, you respect the conditions that they have to work with, that you understand that some of your contributors might be struggling with basic things that you don't even think about. So I would say that passion, very useful, but also having a very clear sense of the coherent narrative that you want to come through. And that matters as much whether it's an edited collection or whether it's a single author. because it's very easy to lose people when you're trying to come at things with so many different angles, and you forget that you need to pull it all together. So those would be my tips. And basically just the arc of storytelling. Every book must feel and read like a story. There has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that flow of storytelling is what is going to ultimately hold your readers and give your book that much more impact. So those would be my tips to anybody who wants to take this on.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think both Tara and Lindy and yourself, Elizabeth, have brought those collections together so well with lovely introductory and summary chapters as well. So thank you so much for answering my questions. And I can see we've got various questions coming in now through the Q&A text box, which I'm hoping you can both also see. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that we have there. And then if anyone would like to ask a question, you can also raise your hand or pop it into the chat. Just a reminder that we are recording today in case that alters how you'd like to share your question. But I'm going to start with a question from Sadas, I think. So Sadas has put a lovely comment in. Very nice to see you here with us today as well. And he said, I'm confident this book will be readily adopted and used by all kinds of marginalised communities in science communication. But how would you propose we ensure that the learnings and insights from both of these books are also accessed and assimilated by the unconverted, i.e. people in science communication who are perhaps not really immersed in discourses of social justice, queerness, race, decolonisation, or worse, are resistant to these conversations? So I guess, how do we bring some of this much more in the mainstream and to those who perhaps aren't wanting to engage in these conversations? So big question to start with. Would either of you like to respond to that?
Can I have a go?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Okay, yeah. Can you thanks, Sadat, for that question. And it's a perennial problem for someone like myself who's been going on about these issues for, as I keep being reminded, over a couple of decades. It is a difficult challenge. But one of the things that I think these books are able to do is to really address the elephant in the room. For too long, these issues have been treated as the proverbial elephant in the room. Well, with these two books out there, it's game over. No one can say now, I don't know what it is about, I don't know what I can do. So that whole kind of innocence is gone. The innocence is gone, the complacency has to go, the blindness has to go, the business as usual has to go, because it's all there in print. Absolutely. And I think that was also, I'm sure for Tara and Lindy and for myself, that was also one of the drivers to say, if we can get this comprehensively out there in print, then the elephant, we're calling out the elephant in the room and we're saying it's got to change. So, and that's going to be progressive. It's going to take time. I don't expect that certain people are going to get up tomorrow and say, that's it, I'm going to be doing this, that, and the other. It's a progressive journey, and you're just going to keep pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope step by step along the way. But having these two books out there, I think, is an absolute game changer for the science communication field. We can no longer go back to where we were after these two books. Absolutely. I'm convinced of that. It's not going to be the same.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I can only speak for my own programme, but there's certainly going to be essential reading on our Masters in Science Communication. Tara, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose, to be brief, I think that these books are written in a way that is hopefully engaging for people who are totally from outside of a headspace of understanding the topics of this space. I mean, I have family members, my mum is reading this book, and this is a very academic book, so it's been a little astonishing for me. But really taking the knowledge and talking about the concepts that each contributor has presented in a wholly different way. So I think that if those conversations are happening for the first time in my life, it seems like a good sign for how we move forward in this space. Yeah, I have my fingers crossed.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Tara. And there's actually a question from Emily that sort of links to this point in regards to how the books might be used. And Emily's asked about thoughts around how people teaching science communication can best use their books with students. So Emily's aware in Tara and Lindy's book that you have resources specifically focused on teaching in these areas. Liz, there's quite a few things coming through in your book as well, but could you elaborate a little bit? How can those teaching science communication use these texts? Tara, would you like to start? As it was,
Yeah. So in addition to, I suppose, the resources that we put at the end of each segment of the book, so clear activities and exercises that we think are a good way of getting students and researchers started on thinking about the different concepts and communities in queer science communication. We also have a beautiful chapter from Elle and Simon talking about what a queer SciComm pedagogy might look like as well. So it's very much dialogue focused. It's embracing uncertainty and change. And I think that that chapter, kind of accompanied with the resources, is probably the best place for people to start. And then I'm anticipating that maybe the students become teachers in a way, because they have a pretty good chance of being much more engaged with queer culture in various forms. And perhaps that comes into the classroom as well.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. We address this issue actually head on with a real life exemplar in chapter 13 from an international student from China who was doing a master's in one of these courses in an Australian university, who had to campaign and really battle to get her own cultural storytelling and her own culture's contributions to science as to be allowed for her research project. And that just shows you the overwhelming nature of this kind of very Eurocentric Western focus in terms of the course curriculum, the materials, as well as the kind of research topics that students are allowed, which I just find ridiculous. What is the point of calling this an international program, an international study, and you invite students from all corners of the world, and yet you have this very narrow Western curriculum and focus. So I really would hope that a book like this would be a very valuable window for these courses to be able to open to students, whether they're from the global north or south, to be able to get that freedom, that flexibility, that sense of wonder, that sense of enabling to be able to bring their own cultural perspectives, their own racial lived experiences into these courses. The other aspect that would be useful, it's not something we put in the book, but I think it's something that some of us have from personal experience, is this idea of having guest lecturers from the global south being involved in some of these courses in the global north. So, for example, a certain university course actually uses the form of advisory lecturers in terms of bringing on board those perspectives of academics from the global south. I myself was challenged to do something like this just before the COVID at a certain university in Europe. I won't mention names. And it was very insightful the week I spent there with those students. First of all, I found myself in a faculty where, guess what? All the academics were white. And yet 50% of the student body were from Africa and Latin America. And it was a struggle for them to be able to get a sense. And I vividly remember this tutorial session. And these were the most impactful sessions apart from the lectures that I gave. I also did small group tutorial sessions with some of the master's students. And I remember this student from Senegal who said to me that, who said in this session, if you hadn't been here, this week has been the most impactful week for me of this program. Because before you came on board, I found myself asking the question, am I going to be going back to my country with a white elephant certificate? Because I could not see any way in which what I had learned, yes, I had learned technical things, but I couldn't see how I could apply it back in my country. I couldn't see how I could go back to my country and be a science communicator, even in the cities, never mind in the rural areas where people like, my grandmother lives. So I think we really need to realize that globalization, as we talk about in the book, internationalization, it shouldn't just be names and gimmicks that we use to attract so-called international students. We need to diversify the academics. We need to diversify the people who are involved in these courses. And if you're not able to do that quickly enough, well, find a way to have an exchange program with academics, with scholars, with researchers from other parts of the world to enrich your program. So thanks, Emily, for that question, but it is absolutely spot on. And a book like this can also help to start to get those enabling conversations going and opening up opportunities for the students and the academics on these courses.
Fully support those points, Elizabeth. Absolutely. I think huge number of opportunities to think about there. I'm conscious of time. We've got just under 10 minutes left. So I'm just going to flag one more question, and then I'm going to address a question from Sophia when I wrap up at the end. But this question is from Andrea. And again, I think it's reflecting some of those issues around representation that Elizabeth's just touched on. So often we see science engagement initiatives that there's an imbalance regarding who's involved in conversations and discussions around inclusion, representation, diversity, etc. in these settings. Often dominant practices relegate these conversations to minority groups, negating therefore the principle of inclusivity. So in your experience, I'm just going to summarize this question a little bit, apologies. Can you point to best practices to help organisations implement inclusivity in a more coherent and comprehensive way? I have to take quite short responses to that question, I'm afraid, but yeah. Elizabeth, can I come to you first? I know there was lots of examples in your book actually around these sorts of considerations.
That's a very pertinent question. And it's quite interesting because if you actually look at what is happening in terms of who is actually currently, as we speak, in the contemporary era, sort of making the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not coming from the marginalized. It's almost now been taken over as a kind of a sloganization. DEI, we now have acronyms. It's become a kind of a buzzwords, and that's the danger. And I think what needs to change is not to have a couple of people of color sitting in one corner and having a conversation, and the dominant other on the other side. What we need, and this is what this book exemplifies, what we need is to have people from both the North and the South, from the different dimensions, having a coherent conversation together. Are you with me? In terms of how we can move forward. And that's what needs to happen. But for that to happen, we need to be able to get the dominant other to be able to give up some of their innocence, to be prepared to share power, to be prepared to hear things that they may not want to hear, but need to hear. And vice versa, we also then need to have the people on the other side being prepared to be able to have a reflexive conversation that says, okay, I understand why things are as they are, but then how can we move forward? So it's a process, it's a journey, it's a two-way street conversation to make that happen. But it cannot, it is the beginning point. The absolute requisite is that you must have inclusive representation in that conversation. Without that, it's a waste of time. You cannot have one group of people speaking for another group of people. The analogy I always say to people see it very clearly on gender. Imagine walking into a room full of men and you're the only woman, and they're telling you how we want to do something for these women. And you're like, excuse me? Which women? I mean, I get this with the old folks, you know, in our cultures, in our African cultures, there's a lot of stuff about respect for the elders, and I'm all for that. But you get these surreal situations where our elders will sit together and they're like, yeah, we must do something for these young people. And I'm like, excuse me, Grandpa, when last were you young? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's surreal. Of all granddads. And it's usually men who, I'm sorry to say, will have this arrogance, sitting there that we got to do something for the youth. Like, when last were you young? Yeah. So we have to be very careful that we understand that the same principles have to apply when we talk about all kinds of exclusion and all kinds of inequalities. You cannot do it for others. At best, you can do with. The best is when they do for themselves. And that is the only way we can move forward. I hope that helps to answer that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sure there was lots of nodding from people in the room for different reasons. Tara, if I can just come to you very quickly, and I know that Lindy's put a great comment in around solidarity as well, which probably touches on this point, and then we will start moving towards wrapping up.
Yes, so I guess organizationally, I would think about who does the work of enabling inclusion, and then who profits from it. And perhaps as allies in the room, we're looking more for those people to be doing the work with the marginalized communities sitting more in an advisory capacity. So thinking about what benefits everyone in growing and diversifying our workforces. And I'll leave it there, Claire, because I know it's brief.
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to share my screen again. Hopefully that's now visible to everyone at home. Thank you so much, Tara and Elizabeth, for those wonderful, insightful comments on the books. You've certainly made me want to go back and read them again. And I'm sure it sounds like there's a few people at home who are really keen to get hold of copies of the books now as well. Just a little bit of further information, and coming back to Sophia's question, I think it was around what's next for the series. Well, we've got a number of books under development at the moment, but not quite at the point, unfortunately, when I can share them. We do have books coming through, continuing around topics associated to inclusivity, but also a number of broader subject areas as well. So as soon as we're able to share some further information on those, we will do. The best place to find out information on the series is through our website. There's also a fantastic webpage with information for authors if you're keen to publish a book in the series. And I've popped here a couple of books as well, not necessarily Bristol University Press books, so this may sound a little contradictory, but if you are keen to think about publishing and perhaps are doing it for the first time, these are great resources to bring some ideas together. But if you're interested in exploring a book proposal for the series, I'm always happy to be contacted and to have a conversation about your idea before you put the time and effort into creating a fully worked up proposal. That's certainly what happened with Tara, Lindy and Elizabeth. So just drop me a line at my email address if you'd like a little bit of further information. And next, I've hopefully got the discount codes for you, but I think these are also in the chat function as well now. So a little thank you for joining us today. There are some discount codes there. Depending on where you're based in the globe, we've got people joining us today from a number of different locations. If one of these won't work for you, again, you can drop me a line and we will try to sort something out. There's a very personal discount code. If you're based in Australia or New Zealand, you actually have to get in touch with someone personally, but hopefully that will work. And just a very big thank you before I stop sharing the slide to Tara, Elizabeth, Lindy for joining us today as well at home in the chat function. I'll stop sharing this now so that I can see everyone. And thank you for your excellent questions, thoughts, ideas. Tara, Elizabeth, Lindy, thank you so much for your first 2 books for this particular series. And also thank you to Bahar, the publisher, for supporting us through this session today. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sure there could be many more questions, and I hope you very much enjoy reading the books very soon. Thank you. Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Thank you. And that will be the end of our session, I think.